The sound of the door opening. Sylvia walked in, brushing the last few snowflakes from her hair. "It's freezing, Mom," she said, settling down beside me. "Mom?" "Yes, honey?" "Were you ever afraid of losing me?" And that was when she asked me that question, the question that knocked the air out of me. Her question wasn't made of words. It was the sound of winter shattering. In the hollow silence it left behind, I heard everything. The cry of a newborn torn from my arms, the bone-deep emptiness that followed, and above all, the heavy silence of the one man who had stood there, watching it all happen. How could I possibly fit an entire ocean of fear into a single word? Yes. No. I owed my daughter more than that. I had to show her. I had to let her feel the freezing ache of despair, the quiet warmth of unspoken kindness, and the strength of a woman who has nothing left to lose. I had to take her back to that house, a house not built of bricks and mortar, but of cold, unyielding control. A place where screaming meant nothing, because the only weapon strong enough to break those walls was silence itself. That's where my story begins, and I invite you to come with me. Back to the echoes of a winter in Duluth, 1992. Subscribe, if you will, and walk beside me through this story, to witness how one family could decay from within, and how a single person saved them all, with nothing more than her silence. Snow kept falling, thick and slow, as if someone were sifting powdered sugar over the city. The birch branches leaned slightly, glowing white under the streetlights. I stood behind the window pane, hands wrapped around a cup of cinnamon tea, watching my daughter Sylvia and my granddaughter play in the yard. Their laughter broke into the wind, fading as quickly as morning breath. I was 56, and sometimes, on quiet winter afternoons like this, my heart would tremble, like an old violin string remembering a tune it once knew. Sylvia tossed a snowball, laughing, then knelt to retie her daughter's scarf. Just a small scene, yet in that golden light, I saw two generations repeating themselves, a mother, a child, and the endless circle of love that never truly closes. I exhaled a thin cloud of mist and murmured to myself, "There are questions a child asks that make a mother return to the place where she once lost everything." The words slipped out like breath meeting cold air. No one heard them, but I did. Outside, Sylvia looked up and waved. "Mom, you okay?" I raised a hand, smiled, then glanced down at my cup of tea. It had gone cold. My hand trembled, not from the chill, but from the memory knocking softly at the door. Sylvia came inside, brushing snow from her coat. The cold clung to her cheeks, tinting them pink. "Were you ever afraid of losing me?" she asked, her voice light as wind. I didn't answer right away. Some questions don't need thought, only the courage to breathe through them. "All the time," I said softly, and smiled. It was a fragile smile, the kind that trembles when the heart is holding a secret words can't reach. Sylvia laughed, not noticing her mother's trembling hand. She bent to pick up a toy from the floor, speaking almost absently, eyes drifting toward the window. "I think I understand that feeling now." I stayed quiet. Between us, the clock ticked softly, steady and patient. Each beat a reminder that time doesn't heal, it only teaches you how to live with the scar. I sank into the wooden chair near the fireplace. On the table, an old photograph sat in a silver frame, worn at the edges. In it, I was 30 years younger, wearing a thick wool sweater, cradling a baby wrapped in a barley-colored blanket. I brushed my fingertips against the glass, as if I could still feel the warmth of that moment. "That winter," I whispered. "I almost lost you forever." The fire cracked softly. The scent of pine resin mixed with cinnamon tea and drifted through the room. Outside, the snow kept falling, and inside me, a door quietly opened. I looked at Sylvia, now a mother herself, living in a gentler world than the one I knew. Yet somewhere, deep in the furthest corner of my memory, there was still a younger version of me, shivering in the winter of 1992 in Duluth, where everything began. The light from the fireplace glowed against the old photograph, casting gold across the face of the woman inside it. She was smiling, but I knew that smile had once been stitched together with tears. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of snow tapping against the glass. Sometimes, just one sound like that is enough to wake an entire lifetime. Sometimes, I thought, the past doesn't fade. It just waits for silence to call its name. And there, in that small house in Minneapolis, wrapped in the white of winter, I knew I was about to tell the story I'd spent my life trying to forget. The wind hissed outside the window, pulling a long sigh through the frame, like someone trying to say something they still couldn't bring themselves to speak. I tilted my cup slightly, watching the cinnamon steam rise and curl before disappearing into the air, just like memories when they're not ready to leave. The firelight flickered, half warm, half still. Sylvia had gone upstairs with her daughter. The house was left with nothing but the wind and the rhythm of my own heartbeat, weaving together. For a moment, I felt like the last person awake in the city swallowed by snow. I set down my cup and looked again at the old photograph. The woman in the frame was still smiling, but I remembered clearly. The smile that day had been sown from trembling and tears. "The winter of 1992 in Duluth," I whispered. "I almost lost you forever." The words slipped out, uninvited, quiet but heavy enough to make the room hold its breath. The steam before me seemed to darken, thicken, then fade into a thin, weightless mist. I touched the edge of the frame, my fingertips brushing a small strand of barley-colored yarn wrapped around it, the last piece I'd kept from that old wool blanket. The thread quivered slightly in the draft sneaking through the door. A tiny movement, yet it tightened my chest. "God," I whispered, "that feeling? I hadn't touched it in more than 30 years, but tonight it came back. It didn't even knock." I rose and walked to the window. Outside, snow fell so thick the streets had vanished, leaving only the amber glow of lamplight spilling across the white. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle called, low, distant, mournful, like a reminder that refused to fade. I closed my eyes. In my mind, the sound of snow turned into wind sweeping across an open field. I saw the low hills of Duluth again, the gray wooden fences, and the farmhouse standing alone beneath a sky made of frozen air. Time tightened, pulling itself backward, thread by thread. The world around me blurred until only the strand of barley yarn remained, trembling gently, like a bridge, still holding between now and then. The light in the room flickered, then softened. I heard my own voice, younger, trembling. "Please, just don't take her." I didn't know if I was dreaming or if I had truly gone back to that year. All I knew was that when I opened my eyes, the fields were covered in snow. The whole world had been swallowed by silence. No ticking clock, no crackle from the fire. Only white, thick, endless, consuming. A young woman, me, 30 years ago, was running across that field, her legs sinking deep into the snow, her arms clutching a baby wrapped in a barley-colored blanket, her breath scattered into the wind, her eyes wide with fear. Behind her, the wooden door slammed shut. Someone screamed. Then the sound disappeared into the storm. My blood turned to ice. I saw every detail. The snow tangled in her hair, the baby's cry fading into the wind, the trembling hands refusing to let go. "Run, Diana," someone in the memory said. "Don't look back." The world spun. Snow erased the horizon. She fell, but never loosened her grip. A thread slipped loose from the blanket, gold against a sea of white, fragile, but burning bright enough to sting the eyes. Then that light began to spread, the gray-white of the snow melting into the warm glow of the present. The sound of wind outside returned, pulling me back to the little house in Minneapolis. I opened my eyes and found myself standing by the window again, breath fogging the glass. The cup of tea on the table still carried a wisp of steam, and that same strand of golden yarn still trembled, just as it had 30 years ago. I sat down and whispered, "It never really ends, does it?" A drop fell onto the photograph. I couldn't tell if it was tea or a tear. Outside, the snow kept falling, and inside me, the story began. I still remember that morning, the sunlight slipping through the lace curtains, pale and cold like a forgotten blessing. Someone at the wedding had said, "Stability matters more than love." I believed them, and so I married Harold, because everyone said stability mattered more than love. I was 23 then, a young nurse who thought happiness could be built with reason, that all it took was patience and practicality. Harold didn't make my heart race, but he had a kind smile, a house inherited from his parents, and a promise that I'd never have to worry about a thing. It sounded like an easy dream, until I learned that sometimes stability is just another word for confinement. The road to the farm wound deep into the outskirts of Duluth. Our small truck rumbled across open fields as the wind whipped against the iron fences, bending even the oldest posts. I remember gripping the steering wheel tightly, thinking the cold here felt different, colder than skin, colder than bone. Harold drove beside me in silence. He didn't look at me, didn't turn on the radio. Only when we stopped in front of the gate did he finally speak. "Welcome home." The words fell softly but hollow. The house before us was gray, its wooden roof dark and damp. There were no birds, no neighbors, only wind, and the long shadows of trees bleeding across the snow like spilled ink. The door opened. Helen, his mother, was waiting. She wore a gray turtleneck sweater, her hands clasped neatly in front of her, eyes sharp enough to carve through skin. "So," she said, voice laced with something between politeness and scrutiny, "Harold's girl has finally arrived." I smiled, trying to hide the tremor in my breath. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Diana." "The nurse's daughter, right? You look tidy enough." Her gaze dropped to the tablecloth I was folding, trying to help. "A nurse's daughter folds a napkin like that?" The words were light, almost casual, but the air froze. I looked down. The corner of the cloth was uneven, half an inch off. Such a small mistake, yet under her stare it felt like proof of unworthiness. Harold stood beside me, still silent. He straightened the edge of the napkin, then turned away, as if the moment didn't matter. But to me, it was the beginning of a lifetime lived under inspection. Helen moved around the room, rearranging everything, her hands quick, precise, certain. "In this house," she said, "we do things our way. You'll just need to learn." She spoke like someone reciting a rule book, unconcerned whether I was tired or frightened or human. I nodded. Yes, ma'am, I'll remember. She smiled thinly. Good. Harold likes women who know how to listen. And in that look I understood. There was no room here for my voice. A gust of wind slammed against the door, rattling the iron fence outside. The sound was low and aching, like metal remembering fire. That night, after Harold fell asleep, I wandered through the house, searching for something, any sound that proved life still existed there. But everything was quiet, smothered by stillness. The kitchen was spotless, too clean to feel used. The dining table long, the chairs perfectly aligned. The clock on the wall ticked, steady, precise, unforgiving. The only trace of warmth was a forgotten teacup on the counter, still faintly fragrant with ginger and honey. I touched it. It was warm. In the far corner, Frank, my father-in-law, was mending a strip of wire mesh on the porch. He didn't look at me, only nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Under the yellow light, his shadow stretched long across the floor, rough, but calm. I didn't know then that his silence that evening would one day save my life. I went back to the bedroom and looked at Harold, already asleep, his face peaceful as a child's. Stable, I told myself. That's what everyone said I needed, isn't it? But when the wind slammed against the iron fence again, I knew I had stepped into a house not meant for living, but for enduring. I used to believe that if I were gentle enough, patient enough, I could make everyone in this house love me. But love isn't something you can beg for. It must be given, freely, or not at all. Our first dinner in the Miller house unfolded in the soft, cold rhythm of silverware touching porcelain. Helen sat at the head of the table, adjusting her napkin for the third time, her eyes darting toward me as if testing whether I knew the proper way to exist. Harold sat across from me, silent, glancing at his mother, avoiding my gaze. When I asked, "Did you make this stew, Mrs. Miller? It's delicious," he only nodded faintly, forcing a polite smile, the kind you wear when you remember that smiling is expected of you. Helen didn't look up. Her voice was even, tight as a wire. In this house, we don't speak while others are eating. I froze, my spoon hovering mid-air. Harold lowered his eyes to his plate, tearing a small piece of bread. No one stepped in to ease the moment. The clock ticked softly on the wall, each sound reminding me this was not my home. Later, as I cleared the table, a spoon slipped from my hand and clattered against the floor. Helen sighed, barely audible, yet heavy enough to crush what little confidence I had left. I bent to pick it up, my fingers brushing the cold wooden floor. She said, "Next time, be more careful. Clumsy women make their husbands look bad." The words nailed themselves into my mind. I looked up at Harold, still seated, still silent, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth as if he hadn't heard. I waited for something, any sign of defense, or even a reassuring smile. But he only took a sip of water and stood. "I'll check the car, Mom." She nodded, and he left, disappearing through the door, leaving me alone with the smell of cooling food and her watchful eyes. If I'm good, she'll love me, I told myself. But Helen's gaze was like a safety pin pressed into skin. Not deep enough to wound, just sharp enough to sting, to remind me of my place. A quiet, obedient place. Small, safe, and squarely beneath her control. That night, after Helen went upstairs, I cleaned the kitchen again. There was nothing left to wash, but I scrubbed and wiped anyway, just to fill the silence, to drown out the sound of the ticking clock. Through the small kitchen window, I saw Frank sitting on the steps outside. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, the flame flickering in his tired, kind eyes. I watched him fix the squeaky door, the rusted hinge giving one short groan before falling still. His shadow stretched long across the snow, steady and unbothered. Inside, the warmth of the fire brushed my cheek, yet my heart was cold, so cold I could hardly feel it beat. I thought of my mother, her laughter, our small apartment, the way we could speak without measuring every word. Then I thought again, if I'm good, she'll love me. Helen came down the stairs for some reason, paused at the doorway, her eyes sweeping over everything before landing on me. "It's late. In this house we go to bed before 10. "Yes, ma'am. I was just finishing up." "Don't overdo it. The habits of servants don't suit members of the family." She turned and went upstairs. Her heels struck the wood, each step measuring the distance between me and them. I looked around. The house gleamed, spotless, untouched. No trace of me anywhere. And that, I realized, was exactly how she wanted it. I sat down on the wooden chair, my hands folded in my lap, listening to the soft ticking of the clock, each beat brushing against my bones. Some houses aren't meant for living, I thought. They're meant for enduring. Maybe it was someone else's thought. Or maybe it was just the part of me learning, at last, how to speak the truth. Outside, Frank still sat by the porch, a small lantern in his hand, shining over the hinge he'd just repaired. The golden light fell across his face, calm, steady, worn. The door was quiet now, no creak, no complaint, only the wind moving through and his shadow, stretching long into the snow. I let out a slow breath, knowing I had just stepped into a new chapter, one where even the smallest voice could echo for years. Mornings in Duluth usually began with fog and quiet, but in this house, quiet was never peace. It was something arranged, thick, cold, and orderly, like Helen's china cabinet. Day after day, her scolding came in drops, like melting ice, never enough to shatter, only enough to crack. "Is this what you call coffee? Breakfast should be ready before Harold comes down. A nurse's daughter who doesn't know how to keep a house?" Each word fell like a chill at the back of my neck. I learned to smile, to nod, and to stay silent. The only thing I never learned was how to keep my heart from tightening every time I heard her footsteps on the stairs. I began to memorize the hours when Helen left the house, so I could steal a little breath. When she went to the market, I'd open the windows, let the wind in for 5 minutes, no more. Even the air here seemed to follow her rules. Enter quietly, disturb nothing. One afternoon, I went out to hang a blanket to dry. The snow hadn't melted yet. The ground glittered with frost. I spread the barley-colored wool blanket across the fence. Sunlight filtered through the yarn, washing my face in gold. For a moment, I felt like the old Diana again, the one who once laughed at the sound of the wind. Then the upstairs window creaked open. Helen's voice came down, sharp and clear. "In this damp weather, you'll mildew everything we own." I froze, then hurried to take the blanket down. I didn't know. "I do, and you should ask before you act." The window slammed shut. A clump of snow fell from the roof and shattered on the ground, scattering tiny drops of water. I looked at them and saw myself. That evening, when I went upstairs, a note waited on my desk. "Don't embarrass Harold in front of the neighbors," written in neat, black ink, precise and cold. No greeting, no signature, just an instruction. It read less like advice and more like policy. I read it over and over, trying to understand how I had embarrassed Harold. Maybe I'd simply asked the mailman for directions. Maybe I'd laughed too loudly when the neighbor's cat wandered onto the porch. In this house, even laughter required permission. When Harold came home late, I showed him the note. He said, "She just cares about the family's image. Don't take it personally." "Harold, I only—" "Shh." He placed a hand on my shoulder, then withdrew it. "Just do what she says. It's easier that way." Easier. 2 simple words, yet they carried more weight than anything else in that house. They sealed every door, silenced every thought, locked away everything I used to be. That night, I couldn't sleep. I listened to the clock ticking, the wind slipping through the cracks, and my heart beating out of rhythm. Then, 3 soft knocks at the door. I startled, certain it was Helen, but when I opened it, the hallway was empty, only the faint scent of ginger tea and a trace of light from the far end. On the floor sat a cup of ginger tea, still steaming. No note, no footsteps, just warmth. I knew it was Frank. The handle faced outward, placed the way decent men do when they mean no intrusion. I lifted the cup, the ginger heat curling through my throat. "Thank you," I whispered, but he was already gone. The porch light swayed gently in the wind. I stepped outside and saw Frank's figure fading into the snow, his back slightly bent, his pace slow, leaving no trace behind. Maybe he understood. Maybe it was pity. But in that house, even a single act of warmth, a cup of tea left at my door, was enough to remind me I hadn't disappeared entirely. I went back to my room and set the cup on the table. The faint heat left a round mark on the wood, like an invisible fingerprint. "God," I whispered, "even this little warmth, it's enough." By morning, sunlight filtered through the window, thin and faded like an old page. I heard Harold calling from the next room. "Mother's wondering why you didn't come down sooner." I placed the cold cup of ginger tea on the table. The scent lingered, spicy and warm, but inside my chest everything felt frozen. I went downstairs, steadying my voice. "I'm making coffee. It'll be ready in 10 minutes. Helen didn't answer. She only glanced at me, her eyes sharp enough to make me shrink without a word. When Harold sat at the table, I handed him his cup. He lowered his gaze and murmured, "Don't upset her." The words fell between us, soft as dust, heavy as stone. I wanted to ask, how did I upset her? But one look at him told me I didn't need to. He didn't know either. He was just repeating what he'd been taught to say. I studied his face, the gentleness in it, the slight hunch of his shoulders, as if he were always bracing for wind. And in his eyes I recognized something familiar. Fear. Not fear of me, but of losing the fragile calm he called family. A memory flickered in my mind. A small boy at a dinner table, biting down on his spoon so he wouldn't cry. Helen behind him, her voice flat and cold. "Men don't cry. I didn't raise a weak one." Frank sat at the head of the table, silent, staring out the window with eyes that had long left the room. Then I understood why Harold never fought back. He'd grown up in the silence of fear. I wanted to tell him, "I'm not your mother's enemy." But before I could speak, he rose, took his cup, and walked away. Only the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain lingered in the kitchen's emptiness. That night, snow fell again. I sat by the window writing in my notebook, a habit I'd kept since nursing school, for all the things I couldn't say aloud. Who am I living for? The words wavered on the page, my hand trembling from the cold. I had no answer. The clock ticked, pressing the silence between every breath. I stepped into the hallway. The narrow passage stretched long and dim, like the inside of a shell. Each creak of the wooden floorboard whispered that this house was always awake, always listening, always judging. Helen passed by, holding a freshly ironed tablecloth. She glanced at me briefly, then walked on without a word. Her silence weighed more than any scolding could. I felt myself fading, bit by bit, day by day. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't cry. I smiled. A small, trembling smile, like lighting a candle in a sealed room. Maybe this child will save me. I placed my hand over my stomach, feeling warmth spread beneath my palm. In the dark, that thought glowed like a lone light. I didn't know yet if it was a boy or a girl, but I spoke to the life inside me as if it could already hear. I'm here. We're going to survive. That was my first small victory, the first time I dared to smile alone in the night. Outside, the wind swept across the roof, carrying the tired sounds of the world. Frank sat once more on the porch, the oil lamp flickering beside him. Through the curtain, I saw him lift a cup of tea, take a small sip, then gaze at the pale sky. No words were spoken, but that look felt like a promise. I realized then, inside that cold, rigid house, there were still two hearts that could feel. One silent out of fear, the other silent out of kindness. I closed my notebook and turned off the light. Before sleep took me, I placed a hand over my belly and whispered, "Tomorrow will be different." Then came the ticking clock, the wind, and silence. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of it anymore. That morning, the sky hung heavy, like a wet blanket pressing down on the world. Light slipped through the window, pale and white, too white to be warm. I sat in the kitchen, my hands resting on my belly, listening to the wind hiss through the chimney. Inside me, something was cracking. Quietly, but surely. Helen stood by the table, adjusting the cups as though she were expecting someone important. She didn't look at me when she spoke. Her voice was thin, metallic, perfectly measured. "I think you should go stay with your mother. Stress isn't good for the baby." I looked up. "I'm fine, Mother. Just a little tired." "It's not about being tired. It's about not fitting in." She turned to pour more coffee, her eyes skimming over my stomach. "You need peace and quiet. Everyone here is busy. I don't want Harold worrying more than he already does." "Harold worries because he cares," I said softly. "There's nothing—" "I've said enough, Diana." Her voice cut clean through mine, gentle, but final. "Children need good air, and pregnant women should know their place." I bit my lip. Their place. The words hung in the air, tightening around my throat like a thread drawn too close. Harold walked in, his coat still on. He looked at me, then at his mother. "What's going on?" Helen didn't turn around. "She's not feeling well. I told her it would be best to spend a few weeks with her mother. Let the baby settle." Harold's voice was low but cold. "Let's not make this a scene. If Mother says it's best, then do it." "A scene? Please, Diana." He cut me off. "She only wants what's good for you." He said it without once meeting my eyes, and in that moment, I remembered the first night I came to this house, when I told myself, if I'm good, she'll love me. Now I understood. No matter how good you are, no one loves the one they never chose. I stayed silent, not in agreement, but because I finally knew resistance had nowhere to go. Harold turned away and started up the stairs. The sound of his shoes against the wood was soft and even, like a countdown. Helen began clearing the dishes, her hands steady, her lips pressed tight. "When you feel better, you can come back, but don't make it sudden. I don't like surprises." I nodded faintly. Yes. One word, but it sounded like a door closing. That night, I packed my suitcase. The sound of the zipper cut through the room like a blade. I folded a few clothes, an old wool sweater, and the barley-colored blanket. As I smoothed it down, I felt a small movement in my belly, like the child inside already knew its mother was about to leave. I sat on the bed and looked around. The room was spotless, so clean it no longer felt alive. On the table sat our wedding photo, me smiling awkwardly beside Harold. I remembered the moment it was taken. Helen stood behind the camera and said, "Smile properly, don't look nervous." And I had smiled, the way she wanted. But now, staring at it, I realized only one person in that picture had truly existed. Her. Outside, the wind howled under the eaves, dragging the cry of the iron fence with it. That same metallic moan I'd grown so used to, I could hear it even in my sleep. I stood, lifted the suitcase, and didn't look back. By morning, snow had started to fall. Heavy flakes drifted endlessly, whitening the road that led to the bus station. I walked slowly, the suitcase trailing a long line behind me in the snow. No one spoke. No one came to see me off. Helen stood behind the window, her face blurred by the glass. She didn't wave. Didn't look long enough for me to know what, if anything, was in her eyes. Harold never appeared. Maybe he was asleep. Maybe he was pretending. I lowered my head, fingers gripping the suitcase handle until my knuckles went white. The cold slipped into my collar, sharp as pins. Ahead, the road toward town was blanketed. No tire marks, no path, no memory of the way back. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of snow, of rusted iron, and somewhere faintly, of freedom. Alone, I walked on. No one waved, but for the first time I felt like I was truly leaving. The bus station at dawn was empty, dreamlike. Cold mist rose from the ground, wrapping around my legs, stinging my skin. I pulled the suitcase closer and sat on the wooden bench, rubbing my belly as if to apologize to the child for leaving this way. From a distance, Frank appeared. His brown coat blended into the snow until he drew near, and I saw his cracked red hands, raw from the wind. "I figured you'd walk," he said quietly, breath clouding in the air. "I did," I answered. "It's not that far." "It's far enough." He lifted the suitcase onto the bus step, then stood beside me, eyes on the white horizon. The way he stood made the silence easier. No questions, no judgment, just presence. "Does Helen know you're here?" I asked. "No, and don't tell her. She thinks I'm in the barn." I let out a small laugh, a strange sound after so long without one. "If it ever gets too hard," he said, voice low but steady, "don't go back. Let your parents keep you safe. Sometimes the oldest person in the house is the one who needs saving most." I turned to him, tears spilling before I could stop them. "Thank you. You're the first person to ever say that." Frank nodded, saying nothing. He reached into his coat pocket and handed me a worn wool scarf. "For the baby. Keep warm." It smelled of smoke and pine, the scent of something honest in a house full of pretense. The bus horn blew, long and hollow through the wind. I stood, lifted my suitcase, and stepped onto the first stair. The driver looked up. "Heading to the city, ma'am?" "Yes," I said, "to my mother's." Frank stepped back, hands tucked into his coat pockets. His figure blurred into the falling snow. Through the window, I saw him bow his head, not in farewell, but as though he were saying goodbye to something he could no longer fix. As the bus began to move, I kept my eyes on him until his shape disappeared into the white. For the first time, I thought, he stepped out of his silence. The road out of Duluth twisted and turned, blanketed in white. The world around me seemed to dissolve into fog. With every curve, the snow hit the glass a little harder, soft, rhythmic, like someone gently tapping on the memories I'd tried to bury. I looked back once more and saw the house fading, the dark wooden roof, the iron fence trembling in the wind. Part of me still wanted to turn around, but another part was too tired. Maybe to survive, you have to stop looking back at the places that made you small. The bus rattled as it crossed a bridge. Warm air drifted from the heater, stinging my eyes. I rested my hand on my belly and whispered, "We're okay now. We just have to keep going." The woman in the seat ahead turned around, a silver-haired lady with a soft smile. "First baby?" "Yes," I said quietly. "Congratulations, sweetheart. It's the hardest and the best thing you'll ever do." I smiled, nodded, but the words caught in my throat. Turning to the window, I traced a faint line on the fogged glass, a thread of gold, the only symbol of hope I still carried. My breath blurred it, then slowly erased it away. Outside, the world was nothing but white. Snow kept falling. But this time, I didn't feel cold. I leaned my head against the window, letting the sounds fade, the crunch of tires over snow, the low hum of the engine, the slow, steady beat of my heart. "Everything will be different," I whispered. As the bus rounded the final bend, the snow covered the glass completely. I saw nothing now but white, as if the world itself was wiping clean the past so I could begin again. The hospital room was small, flooded with cold white light. Outside, snow mixed with rain tapped against the window, blending with the metallic rhythm of the heart monitor. My breath grew heavy, then broke into a cry. Not mine, hers. A healthy baby girl. The nurse's voice rang out, clear, warm, like a door opening after months of darkness. I turned my head, my hair damp with sweat, and saw my child for the first time. A tiny red face, eyes closed, small hands reaching for the air. Those hands trembled, then curled, as if promising me they'd never let go. I began to cry, softly, not the loud kind of crying, but the quiet one that only the heart can hear. Everything around me blurred, until all that remained was the steady sound of her breathing. A nurse laid the baby on my chest. Her skin was warm, soft, with the faint scent of milk and ginger, the same smell from the tea someone had brought in. I pressed my cheek to her hair and whispered, "Hello, sweetheart. I'm here." The room fell into a strange, sacred silence, as if the entire hospital had paused to bow before this small, new life. At the foot of the bed stood my mother. Her coat was soaked through with snow. Strands of gray hair stuck to her forehead, but her smile, warm, real, wiped away everything else. She bent down and took her granddaughter in trembling hands. "Now you have a reason to be strong," she said. Her voice was rough, but steady, like spring thaw breaking through frozen ground. I nodded, unable to speak. Every pain I'd just survived melted into tears, not of hurt, but of release. Outside, the snow kept falling. Through the window, I watched the car lights blur across the wet pavement, glowing like threads of gold against the white. For a moment, I thought of Frank, the only one who'd seen me off that morning. If he knew I'd had the baby, I imagined he'd smile quietly, the way he always did. I took my mother's hand. My voice trembled. "Mom, I'm scared I won't be enough." She smiled, her warm palms smoothing my hair. "No one's ever enough, Diana. But you have love, and that will carry you through everything." The door opened. A nurse said gently, "There's a call for you. Someone named Harold." I looked at my mother, then nodded. She took the baby while I reached for the phone. His voice came through the line, clear but distant, as if a snowstorm had settled between us. "Good. It's a girl?" "Yes, she's healthy." "Good. I'll handle the birth certificate." And that was all. No "how are you?" No congratulations. No "how much does she weigh?" Just a few short, clean sentences, like someone reading the results of a test they already knew the outcome of. I stayed silent. Only the sound of my baby's heartbeat filled the space between us. "I'm fine too," I said quietly, but the line had already gone dead. An emptiness pressed against my ear. I set the phone down and looked at my daughter asleep in my mother's arms. Her breathing was steady, her lips parted slightly, as if smiling at her first dream. My mother whispered, "You don't need anyone to teach you how to love your child. You only need to believe you deserve to be loved." I nodded, tears slipping into the pillow. In that white room, every sound faded away. All I could hear was the heartbeat of my child, soft, steady, filling the hollow spaces inside me. "Your name will be Sylvia," I whispered. A promise, more than a name. Outside, the wind pushed the clouds aside. The first light of morning slipped through the window, landing on the barley-colored blanket I had brought with me. I touched it. It was warm. And in that moment, I knew. I had crossed the line between fear and love. I held the phone a little longer, waiting for the signal to return, but the line stayed silent, just the faint sound of wind. The call ended, clean, cold, like a door closing without a sound. I set it down, the emptiness heavy in my chest. Tears fell onto my daughter's forehead, soaking into her skin, soft as new paper. She stirred, her tiny lips trembling, then relaxing again. I wiped my tears with my sleeve and whispered, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm not crying because I'm weak. I'm crying because you deserve better than this." The room grew quiet again, only the sound of her breathing and the soft patter of sleet against the window pane. I listened as the rhythm of the storm joined the rhythm of her heart. 2 different beats, both keeping me alive. Leaning down, I kissed her forehead. "Sylvia," I whispered, "you're the reason I'm still here." The moment her name left my lips, I felt myself breathe again, for the first time in months. The name carried warmth, like light breaking through snow. It wasn't just the name of a child, it was proof that life still allowed beginnings. My mother smiled from beside the bed. She placed her wrinkled, gentle hand on my shoulder. "When you were Sylvia's age, I had nothing, too. Just these hands. And you." She chuckled softly. "You know, they say daughters become the women their mothers once feared. Strong and never quiet." I laughed under my breath. "I think I'm not afraid anymore." She brushed my hair aside, then stood, saying she'd go get some soup. When the door closed, the room fell quiet again. Light shimmered across the walls, forming soft, trembling circles, like breath made visible. I reached into my bag and pulled out my old wallet. In the small pocket was a photograph of Frank, the gentle man with the sad eyes. I remembered him standing in the snow, saying the words that had made me cry. "If it ever gets too hard, don't go back. Let your parents protect you." I'd never forgotten that look, neither pity nor judgment, only belief. A small kind of faith, but enough to keep me alive all this time. I placed the photo on the bedside table, next to the barley-colored blanket. Light from the window caught the glass, and for a moment his face seemed to glow, as if smiling back at me. "I didn't come back for my husband," I murmured, "but for Frank's words, because someone believed in me." The thought echoed through my mind, slow and sure, like a heartbeat. Maybe someone once said that a woman only needs one person to believe she's real, not to rescue her, not to promise anything, just to see her. I nodded and smiled toward the photograph. "Thank you," I whispered. A small breeze slipped through the crack in the window, brushing against the edge of the blanket. Dust shimmered in the sunlight, tiny as snowflakes. And in that instant, I thought of everything I'd left behind, the cold house, the wind, the door that had once closed behind me. Now, the same wind carried warmth. Sylvia stirred, her fingers curling around the fabric of my sleeve, a small instinctive motion that softened my whole heart. I wrapped my hand around hers, tiny and warm, full of life. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky wasn't bright yet, but no longer gray. Above the rooftops, a faint streak of blue began to show. And I knew, though storms would still come, I would keep going. Not for anyone else, but for Sylvia, for Frank, and for the small part of me that still believed there is a place where love asks for nothing in return. The road back to Duluth was as white as the day I'd left it, only this time I carried Sylvia in my arms. Snow blanketed the iron fences, and as the car turned the final bend, I caught a glimpse of the old wooden house, still gray, still silent, as if no one had ever truly lived there. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch. My hand trembled, not from the cold, but from memory pressing against my skin. The door opened and Helen smiled faintly. "Back so soon?" Her tone wasn't sharp, but it didn't need to be. It carried the reminder that I had never been welcome here. I held Sylvia closer and nodded. "It's freezing out. I didn't want her to catch a chill, So you came back," she cut in, lips curving into a thin smile. "Well, that's fine. The child needs somewhere stable. That little apartment in the city was never much of a home." She reached out for Sylvia, quick, practiced, as if the baby had always belonged to her. "From now on, she'll stay with me. This house is being transferred soon. It needs someone responsible here." I froze. "Transferred? To whom?" "To Harold, of course. He's the only son. You're an outsider." She said it softly, as if discussing the weather. "Stay a while if you must. Rest. I know you mean well, but this home needs a steady hand." I looked at my daughter, Sylvia, giggling, tugging at Helen's sleeve, blissfully unaware. The sight was sweet, and it hurt. Trying to steady my voice, I said, "I just wanted a few days to let her get used to being here. No need to explain. I understand." Helen turned and carried Sylvia inside. "The nursery's still warm. I kept everything as it was, because I knew one day you'd come back." It sounded kind, but every word fell like a blade. I stood in the entryway, snow melting on my shoes. The air smelled of old wood, ginger tea, and smoke from the stove. Everything familiar, yet stripped of warmth. From the staircase, Harold appeared, his shirt buttoned perfectly, hair neatly combed, his face set and smooth, like paint that had dried long ago. He looked at me. No smile. "You're back. I just wanted for Sylvia to see her grandparents." He nodded once, then said flatly, "I've already put down the deposit. Once the divorce papers are finalized, you'll go." No pause, no eye contact, just a statement, clean, precise, like reading from a contract. "Harold?" I tried to keep my voice steady. "Are you really doing this?" "It's already signed. The house will be in my name. Mother says it's fair." "And Sylvia?" "Of course she stays here. It's the safest place for her." I looked at him, searching for the man who once promised I'd never be alone, but all I saw was a hollow shell shaped by duty. "Don't you see how wrong this is?" I asked. He shrugged. "Wrong? I'm just doing what's right. You'll manage your life, I'll manage mine." Silence thickened, heavy enough to fill the house. I could hear the wind striking the window frame, the clock ticking, each sound sharp, mechanical, merciless. I turned away, hiding my shaking hands. Helen sat in her armchair, holding Sylvia, her gaze distant, fixed on the window. Light touched her hair, glinting like steel. "I knew you wouldn't last long here, Diana." Helen's voice drifted through the air, light as ash. "Weak women never do," I clenched my hands, fighting to keep my breath steady. But inside, something shifted, a pain that no longer wanted to stay quiet. I turned to look at my daughter one last time before heading upstairs to the old room. Halfway up the stairs, I heard Sylvia's laughter. The sound slid straight through me, soft as silk, sharp as a blade. "Wait for me, sweetheart," I whispered, not sure if she could hear. And in that moment, I realized what I feared most wasn't being cast out. It was being erased from my own child's memory. The air in the room felt thick, heavy as fog. Helen still held Sylvia, her arm swaying gently, not with tenderness, but possession. "Mother, let me hold her."
"She's not used to the house yet." "No need," she said evenly, her tone smooth and cold. "The child should grow familiar with someone who actually knows how to care for her." I stepped closer, but Helen raised a hand, stopping me mid-motion. "Don't make a fuss. She's tired." My heart pounded. I didn't dare raise my voice, afraid the sound would startle Sylvia. But when I saw her tiny arms reaching toward me, I couldn't stay still. "Helen, please." "Please what?" She lifted her head, her eyes gleaming, sharp enough to cut the air between us. "You came back unannounced. What makes you think you have any right here?" I trembled. I just wanted her to visit, just to see her grandparents. "Don't you understand?" She interrupted, her voice lowering to a cold precision. "This child needs stability. She needs adults. She doesn't need you." The words hit like a stone dropped into still water, no echo, just a suffocating quiet. Then Sylvia cried. At first it was a whimper, then it tore open, raw, loud, desperate. The sound clawed straight through me. I rushed forward, but Harold caught my shoulders. "Diana, don't make a scene." "Don't make a scene? My baby is crying!" I tried to pull away, but his grip held, firm, not violent, just cold, like restraining a stranger, not a wife. "No," I gasped, my voice breaking. "Please don't take her from me. Please." My knees gave out. My arms were empty, weightless. It felt as if my body had been separated from its soul. I watched Helen walk past me, her heels clicking against the wood, measured, deliberate. There, Sylvia," she murmured, voice sweet but hollow. "Grandma's here now." I looked around, searching for a single kind gaze, but every face was turned away. Harold stood beside them, silent. The room grew too bright, too clean, so pure it left no space for air. I pressed my palms to the floor, nails scraping into the wood, leaving small white marks. "Please, don't," I whispered. Helen tilted her head, studying me as if I were a stain on her perfect floor. "She'll be fine," she said softly. "Go rest. Don't make this any more shameful than it already is." Her words slid through me like metal, quiet, unyielding, precise. I wanted to scream, to fight, to reach for my child, but my legs wouldn't move. My strength had vanished. Sylvia's crying grew distant, echoing through the house, bouncing off the walls, a sound that begged for help I couldn't give. Then a voice, low and steady, cut through the air. "Give the child to her mother, now." The room froze. Helen turned, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. I looked up. Frank stood in the doorway. He wore his old brown coat, the sleeves still smudged with dirt. He must have come straight from the stables. Afternoon light spilled across his shoulders, turning the edges of his gray hair to silver. Helen's tone dropped, tight and wary. "What are you doing here?" Frank didn't answer. He stepped inside, each footfall deliberate, solid. His gaze fixed on Sylvia, still wailing in Helen's arms. "Helen," he said quietly, "give the baby to her mother." "You don't understand." "I understand," he cut in, "and I've understood for far too long." The air thickened. Harold looked from his father to his mother, his mouth open,
words caught somewhere between them. I knelt on the floor, trembling, hardly believing what I'd heard. Light streamed through the doorway, falling across Frank's shoulders, stretching his shadow until it reached my hand on the ground. For the first time, someone stood between me and Helen, not to judge, but to protect. The air inside the house seemed drained, stripped of oxygen. Only Sylvia's cries filled the space, breaking against the walls, catching in my chest. I lifted my head, heart pounding wildly. Frank stood in the doorway, steady, his eyes no longer carrying the tired haze I'd always seen. "Give the baby to her," he said. The words were low, calm, but heavy enough to stop the room in its tracks. Helen turned, her gaze flickering, shock flashing for an instant before her familiar chill returned. "What are you saying, Frank? Can't you see she's unstable?" Frank took a step forward. His voice stayed even, every word deliberate, striking like a hammer on wood. "I see her. I see everything, and I've been silent for far too long." Helen arched an eyebrow, a thin smile curling on her lips. "Another man gone soft over a woman's tears?" "No," Frank said quietly, eyes fixed on the baby in her arms. "I'm not soft. I'm just tired. Tired of cruelty dressed up as righteousness." Helen froze. Her mouth tightened. Her grip on Sylvia grew harder. From the stairs, Harold descended, his face pale, uneasy. "Dad, you don't understand." "I understand," Frank interrupted. His voice was steady, almost frighteningly so. "I saw the house deposit on the kitchen table." The room went still. Helen turned sharply, fury rising in her eyes. "You went through my things?" "No," Frank replied. "I was getting water. The paper was right there. Perhaps you left it out because you assumed no one in this house had the courage to look." Helen's face blanched. Her eyes darted toward Harold. "You—" "Mother," Harold stammered, his shoulders trembling. I didn't want us to lose the house." "And so," Frank said evenly, "you'd take a child from her mother, just as you both took my voice from me in this house years ago?" I rose to my feet. My legs trembled, but my spine held straight. In Helen's arms, Sylvia squirmed, her cries softening, as if she could feel the weight pressing down on everyone in the room. Helen gave a short, brittle laugh. "Frank, you don't know her. She's weak, unstable. A child needs direction." Frank looked at her for a long time. "I know her," he said. "She's the only one left in this house who still knows how to love without expecting anything in return." His words struck something deep inside me. Helen's eyes hardened. "You'll regret this. Don't let your emotions ruin everything. This family still has its honor, its rules." Frank shook his head slowly. "Honor doesn't survive when it's used to hide cruelty." I looked at him, the man who had spent his life bowed, quiet, invisible behind his wife's shadow. And yet now he stood tall in the center of the room, calm but unbending, his voice carrying the kind of strength that comes only from truth long suppressed. "Harold," he said, turning to his son, "look at them. That's your wife. That's your child. If you stay silent today, you'll never escape the silence I've lived with." Harold stepped back, lips moving without sound. Helen turned away, her hands trembling, fighting to hold her composure. "Frank, I'm warning you. No need for warnings," he said quietly. "I just want you to understand. Silence is no longer an option." I stood behind him, frozen. Sylvia was still in Helen's arms, but now those hands had begun to tremble. Wind hissed through the cracks in the door, carrying the scent of pine and snow. The whole house hung suspended somewhere between fear and release. For the first time, I saw Frank alive.
The moment shattered when Helen's voice rose, sharp as splintered glass.
"You're betraying your family!"
Her words cracked through the wooden walls like a whip. Frank didn't flinch. The light fell across his shoulder, his face calm, still, terrifying in its steadiness. "No," he said, slow and clear. "I'm saving it from rotting." The room seemed to stop breathing. Harold froze at the foot of the stairs. Helen's chest heaved, her lips trembling, but no words came. Frank stepped forward.
He extended his hand, steady, unhurried, not demanding, not forceful, just undeniable. "Helen," he said softly, "give the child to her mother." "No, you're being a fool!" "Maybe," Frank replied, "but I'd rather be a fool than a man who stays quiet." Then he turned to me. His eyes met mine, not with pity, but with trust. "Take your daughter," he said. "This time, don't bow." I stood there, paralyzed, my legs still weak, my hands still shaking, but his gaze held me upright. Helen clutched Sylvia tighter. The baby's cries broke into sharp, gasping sobs, her tiny arms reaching out toward me. I took a step forward. "Helen, please." "Stay back!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "She's poisoned you, Frank! She's tearing this family apart!" Frank didn't answer. He only placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "This family tore itself apart long ago," he said, "the day I let you turn love into law." Helen jerked away, her eyes flashing like a cornered animal. And then, for the briefest second, I saw something in her face. Not fury, fear. Sylvia cried again, louder this time. I don't know who loosened their grip first, Helen or her own trembling hands, but in that instant, Sylvia fell into my arms. Her warmth hit me like a pulse, and I broke. Tears came hard and fast as I pressed her close, burying my face in her hair, breathing in milk and skin and life, the scent they had nearly stolen from me. "I'm here," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Mommy's here, sweetheart. I'm here now." Helen stood motionless, her arms hanging limp, her face gone pale. Harold lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Frank stepped back. His eyes glistened, breath unsteady, but a faint, weary smile touched his lips. Small, sad, and real. Inside me, fear and gratitude tangled into one warm, living thread that spread through my chest. So this was his silence, I thought. Not cowardice, just a conscience that had slept too long. Frank looked at me and gave a small nod. "Take her outside, Diana," he said. "Go breathe." I stepped past the threshold, the baby still crying softly against my chest. The wind hit my face, cold, sharp, but inside, I felt warm. Warm in a way that started deep, where truth lives. I turned back once more. Frank still stood inside, between Helen and Harold, like a man guarding a flame on the verge of dying out. Afternoon light slanted through the window, catching the clock on the wall. The ticking stopped. No more sound. Only the soft breath of wind, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. And I knew, from that moment on, silence in this house no longer meant fear. It meant the beginning of freedom. The next morning, snow still blanketed the porch. Light seeped through the kitchen window, thin, cold, and deliberate. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of burnt coffee, old wood, and something about to change. Frank stood at the head of the table. In front of him lay a brown envelope. He set it down slowly, then spoke, his voice steady, clear enough to still every sound in the house. "Inside is a draft of the divorce papers," he said, "and a sum to help you start over. Tomorrow morning, the sheriff will witness the transfer." No one spoke. Helen lifted her head, eyes narrowing. Harold stood beside her, his face struck with disbelief. "What are you talking about, Dad?" he asked, his voice taut, trembling slightly. "It means," Frank replied evenly, "that Diana and Sylvia will leave this house with every legal right they deserve." The words fell like the final nail on the coffin of silence. Harold's face flushed red. He gripped the edge of the table. "So you're choosing her over your own son?" Frank looked up. His gaze was calm, unmoving. "I'm choosing what's right over what's cowardly." Each word landed heavy, not out of anger, but because they'd been held back for 20 years too long. Helen gave a sharp, icy laugh. "Do you even know what you're doing, Frank? You're destroying this family." Frank didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, a long, unwavering look that made her glance away first. "No, Helen," he said quietly. "This family's been decaying for years. I'm just cutting out what's already dead." Harold slammed his palm against the table. "You have no right to do this. This is my affair." "Your affair," Frank said, slow and level, "became a matter of law the moment you signed the property deposit under your parents' names. I've read the papers, Harold." Helen cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. "What are you planning to do? Hand everything over to her? To a woman who cries better than she lives?" Frank turned toward her, his tone low but unyielding. "She's asked for nothing, but I won't let a child grow up in a house where kindness is mistaken for weakness." Helen froze. For the briefest second, her face faltered, a flicker of something raw, something human, but it passed. "You'll regret this," she whispered. Frank's voice was quiet, almost tender. "I've been regretting my silence for 20 years." The room felt suddenly colder, as if the air itself had paused to listen. I sat in the corner, holding Sylvia. She slept soundly, her tiny fingers wrapped around mine. Every word struck deep, echoing in my chest, not like fear anymore, but like the sound of freedom being spoken out loud for the first time. Helen stood abruptly, her chair crashing to the floor behind her, the sound sharp and final. "Have you forgotten who I am? This house, this family's name?" "They're the things I've carried like a stone around my neck," Frank interrupted. "And today I'm setting them down, giving them back to where they belong, to the truth." Helen stared at him, rage blazing under her composure, then turned toward me. "You think you've won? Don't fool yourself. A piece of paper doesn't wash away the fact that you tore this family apart." I opened my mouth to answer, but Frank spoke first. "Diana didn't destroy anything," he said firmly. "You just used the word family to hide your fear of losing control. And that's not love, Helen. That's obsession." Her lips parted, but no sound came. The fight drained out of her shoulders. Harold turned away, pale, silent. Frank reached into the cupboard, pulled out another folded sheet, and placed it on top of the envelope. "I spoke with the sheriff," he said. "He'll be here tomorrow morning to witness the signing. No one in this house will ever force her to stay another day." Then he turned to me, and his voice softened. "I don't know where you'll go, Diana," Frank said quietly. "But this time you're leaving for yourself, not because you're afraid." I looked at him, my eyes burning but dry. I couldn't speak, so I just nodded. In my arms, Sylvia stirred, as if she could feel something shifting in the air. Outside, the snow had stopped. Morning light slipped through the window, landing on the envelope that sat on the table. something thin, fragile, yet filled with the weight of choice. The house sank into a dense, aching silence. Helen said nothing. Only the wind pressed against the windows, lifting the curtains slightly, like the house itself was exhaling. I sat in the chair, Sylvia against my chest, her skin warm against my heart. Her steady breathing softened the exhaustion that had settled deep inside me. Frank stood at the table, looking at the envelope that hadn't moved. His voice came low, as if he were speaking to himself. "You can lose a house," he said, "but you shouldn't lose your humanity." I forgot that once. I bit my lip, trying to hold the tears, but they came anyway. "Thank you," I whispered, "for choosing to stand on the side of what's human." The words came out like breath, but when they reached the air, the whole room fell silent again. Frank turned to me, his eyes kind and steady. "I didn't do something noble, Diana. I'm just paying an old debt, the debt of all the years I kept quiet." My throat tightened. I couldn't answer. He walked to the chair by the stove and picked up the barley-colored blanket, the same one that had wrapped Sylvia when she was born. He laid it gently over her crib, each movement careful, almost reverent. "Sleep now," he murmured. "You're safe." His hand trembled slightly as he tucked in the edge, but his gaze was firm. In the dim evening light, the lines on his face looked carved, like the map of a man who had finally earned forgiveness. Helen stood by the doorway, watching him. Her eyes had lost their fire. They looked clouded, hollow. Perhaps, in that silence, she finally understood that everything had fallen apart, not because of another woman, but because she had built her world on fear. Harold sat at the table, head bowed, fingers gripping the wood. For the first time, he didn't look like a man, just a lost boy watching the old world crumble around him. Frank turned from the fire. His voice was low but gentle. "Tomorrow it'll all be done. For now, let tonight be quiet." He walked to the fireplace, dropped a few more logs into the flame. The fire flickered, its amber glow dancing across the walls, glinting on the framed photographs. In one of them, I saw my reflection, a woman holding her child. Behind me stood Frank, tall and steady, and somewhere in the background, Helen's shadow faded into the light. 3 generations, their outlines blurred by firelight, distorted, imperfect, yet somehow still connected, by something finer than blood. Conscience. Frank sat down, eyes fixed on the fire. "You know, Diana," he said softly, "sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a house is stop pretending it's still whole." I looked at him and saw it, the quiet glow of release, not happiness, but peace. "And sometimes," I whispered, "the kindest thing a woman can do is stop letting others decide her worth." He smiled faintly, nodding, as if he'd been waiting years to hear those words spoken aloud. Helen turned and left the room. Her footsteps were light, but her heels struck the wooden floor with slow, echoing certainty, like the lingering rhythm of a past that refused to disappear entirely. The fire burned on. Amber light washed over Sylvia's sleeping face. I brushed her hair back, my fingers tracing the soft threads of the barley-colored blanket, each one warm, woven with memory and courage. Outside, snow began to fall again, thin and quiet. But this time it didn't feel cold, and I thought to myself, maybe tonight we finally began again. That morning the sky was clear. Snow still covered the ground, but a thin light had begun to pour through the clouds. I heard the door open, then close. Helen and Harold left without a word. No goodbye, no final glance. Only the crunch of tires grinding over frozen ice, and the sharp wind slipping through the cracks, cold enough to sting. The door shut. A thin whistle rose from the seams, and the white curtain by the window fluttered once, then fell still, as if the house itself had exhaled after years of holding its breath. I stood there, watching the empty path. I didn't feel like I'd won. I didn't feel anger anymore, just an odd kind of space inside. Like when you finally pull a rusted nail out of a wall. It hurts, but the air feels cleaner. Frank said nothing for a while, then, simply, "It's done." His voice was low and hoarse, carrying smoke and winter. I wasn't sure if he was speaking to me or to himself. The house, after the storm, sounded different. Every noise was distinct now. The spoon touching a plate, the floorboards creaking, the fire cracking softly in the hearth. That night we shared our first dinner together, just the two of us. No conversation, no need for it. I passed him the vegetables, he ladled soup. Every gesture was slow, deliberate, as though both of us were afraid to disturb the fragile stillness that had finally settled. The golden light from the hanging lamp fell gently across the wooden table, making it look warmer than it had in years. Frank sat upright, eating little, pausing sometimes to stare out the window. Maybe he was thinking of Helen, or maybe he was just counting the wind. "You should eat a bit more," I said softly. "I'm fine," he murmured. "You eat. You'll need strength for the little one." I smiled faintly. "She's sound asleep. I'm still not used to this kind of quiet." He nodded. The spoon in his hand touched the bowl, a small, clear sound in a house that had once been full of slammed doors and shouted orders. I lifted my head and realized what I was hearing. Silence. The kind of silence I'd once thought didn't exist. "Does it feel strange to you?" I asked. "What does?" "The quiet." "Not strange," he said after a pause. "Just new. You're not used to it yet." That word, new, stopped me. No one had ever used it for my life before. When the meal ended, he washed the dishes while I cleared the table. Neither of us looked at the other. Yet the air wasn't heavy anymore, only the gentle fatigue of two people who had survived a storm and were still breathing. Later, upstairs, I found Sylvia asleep in her crib, her face soft and peaceful. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. The sky was dark, but the snow reflected moonlight so bright it almost hurt to look at. I hadn't known that peace could have its own sound. The rhythm of a child's breath, the sigh of wind along the roof, the quiet murmur of a house finally learning how to breathe again. But near midnight, I woke to the sound of the wind. A sharp gust rattled the window pane. My heart thudded as I sat up. For a moment, through the glass, I thought I saw someone standing outside, a small, still figure in the snow. The shape was faint, but it looked like Helen. I rose and stepped closer. The air that seeped in was cold enough to burn. "Who's there?" I whispered. No answer, only the wind, weaving through the pines, turning into a long, thin sigh. I unlatched the window and opened it slightly. Outside, the world was silent. No footprints, no headlights, no movement, just snow, falling softly onto the white of what felt like a blank page. I closed the window and leaned back against the wall, my chest still heavy. Then I heard Sylvia stir, a soft, sleepy whimper that pulled me back from whatever shadow my mind had chased. I sat down beside her crib, laid a hand on her back. Her breathing steadied, and slowly, the wind outside began to calm too. And I realized, peace isn't something that simply arrives. It's something you have to learn to trust. It takes time for the heart to believe that when the wind moves, it isn't someone returning. It's just the world reminding you that you're still here. I stayed there, watching her. The small nightlight cast a gold glow over her hair, turning it the color of honey. She slept soundly, her tiny hand curled, her breath soft and even. I looked at her for a long time, still unable to believe that we'd made it through the storm. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, but its sound now felt like a lullaby. The old wooden house no longer creaked from fear. It breathed, slow and steady, like a body recovering from fever. I bent down and kissed her forehead. I'm here. No one will take you again. My voice trembled, not from fear, but from the strange, quiet truth that, for the first time in years, I actually believed my own words. Sylvia shifted, then settled again. A tiny smile brushed her lips. The lamplight touched her face, and its warmth brushed against mine, soft as the firelight Frank had kindled the night before. I sat there longer, keeping my hand over her chest, needing to feel each breath to be sure it was real. Every rise and fall of her lungs felt like a small resurrection inside me. Then a faint creak came from the hallway. I turned. Frank stood by the doorframe, one shoulder resting against the wood, hands in his pockets. His face looked tired, but kind. The dim light from the lamp traced the lines on his forehead, the etchings of time, silence, and redemption. He nodded once, slow, steady. No words, none needed. In his eyes I could read it clearly. It's all right now. I smiled. Thank you, I whispered. Frank answered with a look, then turned away. His shadow stretched down the hallway, long and gentle, fading as the outer light went out. The house grew quiet again. No more voices, no more doors slamming. No one left afraid of anyone else. Only the wind outside, whispering softly through the trees, and the steady breathing of a child who finally slept in safety. I listened. The silence no longer felt heavy. It had rhythm, warmth, a heartbeat of its own, as if the house, too, was finally resting after years of sleeplessness. Sometimes, quiet is the way a house says, "You're safe now." The thought came and stayed, winding through me like a gentle current. I leaned my head against the crib's edge, my eyes drifting shut. The warmth from Sylvia's body spread to mine, and from me to the woolen blanket, until it seemed to fill the whole room. On the wall, the family photo still hung there, but in the dark, Helen's face had disappeared into shadow, while the light lingered on Frank's. A small, still glow, enough to remind me that someone, at last, had chosen right. I remembered what he'd said the night before. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a house is to stop pretending it's still whole. And now, I understood the rest of it, and let it breathe. I pulled the blanket up over Sylvia's shoulders. Our breaths fell into sync, hers and mine, quiet, certain. Outside, the night deepened. The moonlight lay across the snow, soft and silver, no longer harsh. I closed my eyes, unafraid of the dark, unafraid of the wind, unafraid of doors. Only lightness remained, a fragile, steady peace, as if the world itself had placed a gentle hand on my back and whispered, "Sleep, Diana. The house has forgiven you." Winter passed slowly, as if even the earth needed to rest after all it had endured. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of dark, rich soil at the roots of the pines. From the eaves, water dripped in slow, even beats, like a clock trying to count back the quiet seconds this house had once lost. One afternoon, I carried Sylvia out onto the porch. She could roll over now. Each time the sunlight touched her face, she laughed and reached out as if she could hold the warmth itself. The air smelled of damp grass and pine sap. For the first time in a long while, I could hear water again, the small waves lapping against the edge of the lake behind the house. Frank stepped outside, a shovel in hand. His coat was dusted with soil, his silver hair caught the light. He pointed toward the lake, where the afternoon sun scattered gold across the rippling water. "Build here," he said. I looked in the direction of his hand. "Here? This close to the lake?" He nodded. "The ground's solid, it won't shift. It's part of my land, my share of the farm. If you're going to start over, start somewhere with light." I stood there, quiet. The wind moved through the birches, whispering like it had something kind to say. "Why?" I asked softly. Frank looked at me. His eyes carried no pity, no penance, only something steady, gentle, and real. "Because Sylvia is my granddaughter, and you deserve peace." The words caught in my throat. It wasn't the land that moved me, but the truth inside the sentence. You deserve peace. No one had ever said it before. I turned to the lake. The water shimmered, reflecting the gray of clouds and the last strokes of gold from the setting sun. A bird crossed the sky, drawing a clean curve through the air. I could almost see it. A small house here, with windows facing the lake, a patch of grass where Sylvia could play, and a desk by the window where I might finally write what's left of my life. "Won't Helen be angry?" I asked, half teasing, half afraid. Frank smiled faintly. "She's been angry with me half my life. Another half won't make much difference." I laughed, quiet but free. The sound carried across the water. Frank's smile deepened. He looked down at the soil, where green shoots were just starting to break through. After a while he spoke again, slowly, as if every word was being measured against the weight of his heart. "Let me stay in her life. That's all I ask." I turned toward him. The sun had dropped lower, the light tracing his shoulders before spilling across the lake. "You don't have to ask," I said. "Sylvia will always have you." He nodded, staring at his hands, cracked, rough, but steady. "I just want her to know," he murmured, "that there was at least one man in this family who would never turn his back on her." I looked away, blinking hard against the warmth behind my eyes. A gust of wind swept across the clearing, carrying the scent of soil and smoke. I held Sylvia close, her heartbeat fast against mine, strong, sure, alive. It felt like proof that a new life had already begun. Frank lifted the shovel and drove it into the ground, one firm, certain motion. "This is good earth," he said. "Tomorrow I'll ask a few men from town to help lay the foundation. We'll build it together." I nodded, unable to find words. As he turned to go, I heard him mutter, almost to the wind, "No house is truly safe if its heart was ever locked." I watched his figure fade down the slope, his body blending into the color of soil and evening light. Sylvia laughed in my arms, her tiny hand clutching the collar of my coat, as if to hold on to this moment, this fragile, honest piece of the present. The last light of day stretched across the lake, pale gold, soft and deep. I knew in that quiet certainty that lives beneath words, this would be the place where we began again, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. I stood still for a long time, trying to steady myself, but something in his voice undid every wall I had built. For years I had fought, convinced myself I needed no one, and yet, with a single sentence, he broke through everything I'd used to survive. I started to cry. Not the kind of crying that comes from weakness, but the kind that comes when something frozen inside finally feels the sun. Holding Sylvia close, my voice shook. "You'll always have a place in her heart. Always." Frank didn't speak right away. His breath came out in a soft white cloud. Then, slowly, he reached for a handkerchief and wiped the tears from my face. "That's enough," he murmured. "Tears aren't the only way to feel lighter." I laughed through the sound of my own sobs. I didn't think I could still cry like this. Good, he said, because people who stop crying usually stop living, too. Sylvia wriggled in my arms, giggling, her tiny fists waving at the sunlight. Frank bent down and offered her a finger. She gripped it, tight, determined. The kind of grip only a child has, one that feels like a promise whispered between generations. The light slanted through the birches, spilling over our shoulders. Frank nodded, his eyes warm and clear, a quiet light, steady and deep, like the glow of a kitchen lamp on a night once filled with fear. My life's not long anymore, Diana, he said softly. But I want this place to stay alive after I'm gone. Not for me, but for those who remain. It will, I said. Not just this place, but everything you've done today. He smiled. A worn, peaceful smile. Good. Then don't let any house of yours ever fall silent the way this one did. A wind rose, carrying the scent of fresh earth and lake water, and the faint sweetness of something beginning. I lifted my face to the fields beyond, gold, wide, shimmering, not the color of loneliness anymore, but of return, of healing. Sylvia reached her hand toward that golden stretch of light, babbling nonsense sounds that somehow made perfect sense. She was seeing her own future, a world no longer shaded by someone else's shadow. Frank closed his eyes and drew in a deep breath. I used to think it was too late, he said quietly. But maybe the best things come only when we've stopped waiting for them. I looked at him, his weathered face lined by sun and years, but lit now by something softer, freer. No longer the silent man who endured, but a father, a grandfather, standing tall and unafraid. We both turned toward the horizon, where the amber light of dusk slid over the lake and the fields. Everything shimmered, earth, water, sky, and even the ghosts of all we'd endured. No music, no words, just the gentle stillness of two people who had come through the storm and still knew how to smile. I held my child closer, feeling the warmth that spread outward from her small, steady heart. Beside me, Frank bent down, picked up a pebble, and tossed it lightly into the lake. The ripples widened, circle after circle, each one fading into the next, like wounds learning how to close. And I heard myself say, almost to the wind, maybe every new beginning starts in the place that once broke. Frank nodded, eyes following the last ripple as it disappeared into light. Above us, the sun sank behind the pines. Its glow spilled over the fields, over Sylvia's hair, over Frank's hands, and the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. Everything was bathed in that quiet amber, the color of endings that have made peace with themselves. A new beginning, not loud, not promised, but quiet, steady, just as peace always arrives, late, but whole. I chose a patch of ground near the birches, where, no matter the season, the leaves seemed to glow with their own quiet light. In the mornings, sunlight filtered through the branches and fell across the lake in trembling gold. By afternoon, the shadows stretched long, calm enough that you could hear fish stirring just beneath the surface. Frank stood beside me, holding a sheet of paper covered in pencil lines. He'd drawn it himself. A rough sketch, simple but certain. A one-story wooden house, slanted roof, wide windows facing the water. "This spot gets good sun," he said, his voice both practical and kind. "No flooding here, and when the snow comes, one fire in the stove will warm the whole place." I nodded, taking in the stretch of brown earth and brittle grass. It was still just land, but in my mind I could already see the house, a place where Sylvia would grow up in light, where there'd be no shouting, no fear. "This really is a new beginning," I said. Frank smiled. "A place to breathe." Just that, and it was enough. A few days later, the men from town came to help. They brought hammers, timber, rope, and the easy laughter that comes with spring mornings. The sound of saws, the rhythmic strikes of nails, and bursts of laughter filled the open air. Each hammer's fall felt like a heartbeat, a pulse knocking life back into the house rising from the ground. Sylvia sat on a blanket, giggling each time wood met wood. Whenever someone passed, she waved both hands as if she were already part of their world. Frank stayed nearby, never taking his eyes off her, a look of tenderness I'd never seen on his face when Harold was a boy. They built the frame first, then the walls, then the roof. I carried nails, passed boards, brewed ginger tea. My palms burned and my shoulders ached, but strangely, the ache felt right, like proof that I was alive. For the first time, I was building a home not to survive, but to live. When the frame was done, Frank came over holding a small wooden sign. He carved the words himself, slow and deliberate, the knife glinting in the light. "Willow House," he read aloud, voice rough. "Sounds peaceful, doesn't it?" "There's a willow nearby," I said, smiling. "And I once cried under another willow, long ago." "Then it's perfect," he said. "Willows bend, but they never break." I looked at him, a warmth rising in my chest. Here was a man who had crossed half a lifetime to finally stand on the side of what was right. That night, after everyone had gone, I sat inside the half-finished house. The air smelled of new wood and pine. Sylvia slept in her cradle. Frank tended the fire, its crackle soft and steady. The golden light filled the room, turning the raw wood into the color of honey. On the table, I opened my old cloth bag and pulled out the wheat-colored blanket. The yarn was frayed, a few stitches loose. I threaded a needle and began to mend it. Each stitch was a breath, each pull of thread a small remembering. I added a new strand, a brighter gold, warmer, stronger. The thread caught the light as it passed through, shimmering like a promise. "To remind myself not to be afraid anymore," I whispered. Frank looked up from the fire, a quiet smile crossing his face. "That's a good promise," he said, "and when fear comes back, you'll have something to look at." "I'll remember," I told him. My hands trembled with exhaustion, but my heart felt light. For once, I wasn't the woman cast out of a home. I was the woman making one. Outside, the moon climbed over the lake, soft as a lantern above the water. Crickets began their song in the wet spring grass. I finished the last stitch, smoothed the blanket, and laid it beside Sylvia's cradle. The fire still glowed, painting the walls in amber. Beyond the window, the birches swayed, their leaves whispering like storytellers. The house wasn't finished yet, but my heart had already settled inside it. When the house by the lake was finally complete, the news traveled faster than I expected. In a small town, stories always have legs, and sometimes they outrun the truth. The first day I took Sylvia to the market, a few women queued by the bakery turned, voices half curious, half pitying. "So, you're living out there with old Mr. Miller, aren't you? Heard you two built that cabin together. Strange, isn't it? Father-in-law and daughter-in-law under one roof." I didn't answer. I only bowed my head in thanks when they stepped aside for me. But inside, I could feel their eyes. The kind of look people give when they don't understand something, but are afraid to miss out on it. That night, when I told Frank about it, he just shrugged and added another log to the fire. "They're not wrong," he said quietly. "Around here, if someone doesn't fit the mold, people will try to bend them until they do." I smiled, adjusting the curtain near the window. "They said I live with my father-in-law?" "Yeah." His gaze stayed on the flames. I laughed softly, my voice no longer bitter. "Well, I told them he's the only one who ever protected me." Frank looked up at me. The firelight flickered in his eyes, and for a moment, my smile seemed to glow in it. That's a better answer than I expected. It wasn't meant to explain, I said, just to remind them. Some things don't need to be understood. He nodded, smiling faintly. Let them think what they will. We know how we live. His voice was calm, light as the wind outside the porch, but beneath it was a peace I'd never felt from any man before. We sat quietly. Sylvia crawled across the floor, playing with the wooden blocks Frank had carved the day before. She laughed when one of them fell, the sound ringing through the wooden room, clear as glass. Do you hear it? Frank asked. Hear what? The house, breathing. I listened. He was right. The little house had its own language. The rustle of wind over the roof, the soft creak of the floorboards, the gentle crackle of fire. All of it blended together, as if the house itself were speaking in the language of wood and breath. Maybe it's grateful, I said, for finally being built from kindness. Frank smiled, his eyes distant but warm. Or maybe, he said, it's celebrating you. I looked around. Everything was still new, the scent of fresh wood, the faint sweetness of paint, but none of it felt strange. It felt right. Outside, the last light of day spread over the new house, sliding down from the roof to the door, across the curtain, and onto the linen blanket I'd just finished sewing. Its golden, wheat-colored threads reflected across the room, so warm I could almost touch the glow. Sylvia crawled toward it, grabbing the edge of the blanket, laughing bright and free. I bent down, held her close, and her hair smelled like new sunlight. Frank watched us, his gaze gentle, peaceful, like a man finally at rest. That's what I hoped for, he said softly. Not to build another house, but to see one truly come alive. I looked out the window. The fields in the distance had turned amber, birds cut across the sky, and the lake mirrored the light like a vast sheet of glass. Nothing was perfect, but everything was enough. And I realized, peace isn't the absence of voices, it's the place where you no longer have to guard yourself against them. I took Sylvia's hand, her tiny fingers wrapping around mine, warm, steady, sure. On the wall, the sunlight leaned in long golden streaks, the same wheat tone of renewal. The house wasn't just a place to live. It was proof that when something is built with love, it never truly falls apart. The years by the lake passed slowly, gently. Each morning, I rose early to make coffee, opened the door to let in the sunlight and wind, and listened to Sylvia running around the house, her hair a wild tangle, her laughter bright and free. Everything seemed enough. Until one afternoon, when I looked out toward the lake and saw a young woman walking by with a small child. They stopped beneath the birch trees. The mother's eyes were full of fear, and the child looked hungry, shivering in the cold. The sight struck something deep inside me, like a hand brushing an old scar. I brought out some bread and milk and invited them in. The woman told me her husband had left, her own mother had turned her away, and that her child was the only reason she was still alive. That night, while they slept on the spare bed in the living room, I sat alone in the kitchen, unable to close my eyes. I remembered myself in that exact place once, a woman sitting in the dark, without a home, without a place to go back to. The next morning, when Frank came by, I spoke before I even had time to think. I want to open a shelter for women who've been left behind. He paused, looking at me through the rising steam of his tea. There was no surprise in his face, only thoughtfulness. What do you need? He asked. I answered honestly, my voice steady enough to startle even me. Land, time, and faith. Frank smiled, slowly, gently, the kind of smile that deepened the lines around his eyes. You've got all three. I went quiet. Maybe I'd been waiting to hear him say that, just once, so I wouldn't have to keep convincing myself. That afternoon, we spread out the land maps. Frank circled a small area behind the lake with a pencil. Higher ground, flat and dry, enough space for one more house. "This part I can sell," he said. "It'll cover the start. After that, apply for a community grant. The town's got a small fund for humanitarian work." I looked at the numbers, the boundary lines marked on paper. "And if they say no?" "Then we rewrite it," he said. "If they still say no, we make it smaller, but we start anyway." So we began with small things. I drafted letters, typed proposals, rewrote plans by hand, each word like laying down the first plank of something I'd never dared to dream of. Frank helped me fill out the application for support. Women's Shelter Project, Willow House Extension. We took photos of the land, made a sign, and hung it on the porch. Shelter Project for women and children facing abuse. Volunteers, materials, and faith needed. At first, people in town were doubtful. Some said, "Who'd want to take in women their husbands left?" Others shrugged. "It's nice, sure, but who's going to feed them?" I listened to it all and didn't react. I only smiled, because every word they said was something I had once told myself, back when I believed kindness was a luxury. Frank came with me whenever paperwork needed signing. He didn't talk much. He just read carefully, line by line, and finally nodded. "Good. Keep going." Some nights we sat together at the table under a small lamp. Frank reread the plans while I corrected spelling errors. At his age, his hands trembled, but his signature remained firm, clear, and straight. I asked, "Aren't you tired, Frank?" He smiled. "No, this makes me feel young again." "Young?" I echoed. "Yes," he said, "because I'm rebuilding what I once destroyed with silence." I didn't answer. I just lowered my head and smiled. Outside, the lake reflected the moonlight, the ripples moving gently, as if the water itself were breathing. And in that moment, I knew the fire within me had truly been rekindled. Not the fire of anger, but the flame of someone who had once burned to ashes and still chose to keep burning for others. When the paperwork was approved, we began. There was no ceremony, no banners, no applause. Just two people, a child, and a piece of wind-swept land. Frank drove the first stake into the ground. He pressed it deep, then looked up and smiled. "Well, there's our foundation. All we need now is to keep it standing." I laughed, tears falling before I could tell if they came from emotion or the wind. Sylvia stood beside us, holding a small stone, trying to copy her grandfather. She tossed the stone to the ground and shouted, "All done!" We both laughed, the sound carried by the wind across the lake. Day by day, Willow House began to take shape. People in town grew curious, then started bringing whatever they could. A few wooden planks, some old chairs, bags of cement, and sometimes just an hour of labor. Someone even brought bread and milk, small things, but filled with faith that this was worth building. Frank went around town, speaking to everyone, his voice rough but warm. No one should be left behind just because they were weak on a bad day. That sentence made people stop. Some were unsure, but in the end, they nodded. Slowly, we were no longer building alone. I remember the morning the first house was finished, its wooden roof slanting toward the sun, white-framed windows, and a small porch facing the lake. Sunlight hit the sign Frank had carved by hand, Willow House, Shelter of Light. I walked up to it and placed my hand on the carved letters. The wood was new, the scent of paint mingling with pine, and I felt myself trembling. The same way I had when I first held my child after that storm long ago. That afternoon, after everyone had left, I opened my old fabric bag and took out the wheat-colored blanket. It had followed me through everything, the cold nights, the losses, the beginnings. I took a pair of scissors, cut a single golden thread from it, and stitched it onto the corner of the wooden sign, right beside the willow leaf Frank had carved. "Our logo," I said. "A leaf and a golden thread, two of the softest things I know, and the strongest." Frank looked at me, his eyes gentle. "They survive because they know how to bend with the wind." I nodded. "Just like us." We sat together in the amber light of dusk, watching the small house reflected in the lake. Everything was silent, but it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the quiet of people who had finally found meaning. When the sun sank completely, I stepped inside. The walls still smelled of fresh paint, the floor rough beneath my feet. But within that empty space, I could already hear the future, the laughter of children, the voices of women, the sound of a stove humming, sounds that hadn't come yet, but I knew they would. I lit the first oil lamp. Its light spread softly across the walls, painting them in gold. Frank stood behind me, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Now," he said, "let it live." I looked at the lamp, then at my reflection in the dim glass. The woman staring back wasn't trembling anymore, nor pretending to be strong. She was simply a mother, a human being doing what was right. I turned the house that once held me captive into a place that frees others. The thought echoed inside me, then filled the air. I spoke softly, but the wind carried it far, as if the lake, the woods, and the sky were all listening. Sylvia ran in, holding a bunch of wildflowers, and placed them on the table. "For the new house, Mommy." I smiled, bending to kiss her forehead. "Thank you, sweetheart. This house belongs to you too." Frank turned on the porch light. The glow spread slowly, spilling across the wooden walls, over the sign where the willow leaf and golden thread met. Together, they weren't just a symbol, they were a promise. I stepped out onto the porch and looked at the lake. The water was still, reflecting the lamp's glow like a small halo in the dark. That night, I no longer felt alone. I saw a path, long, hard, but bright. And I knew the fire that had just been kindled inside me would never go out, because it wasn't burning for me alone. On the first morning Willow House opened its doors, the fog still hung thick over the lake. Sunlight filtered through the drifting mist and spilled across the newly painted white windowsills. Inside, the house smelled of fresh wood, warm bread, and something else. The quiet scent of hope, freshly unwrapped. The bell above the door chimed softly. The first woman stepped in, around 25, pale, holding a newborn in her arms. Her eyes lifted toward me, full of doubt and fear. "Come in, sweetheart," I said gently. "It's warm here." She hesitated, then stepped over the threshold. Her coat was wet with dew, her shoes caked with mud, but there was something in her step, the faintest sense of laying down a little piece of fear. After her came others, young mothers, women with nowhere left to go. One had fled her home in the night with her child. Another had just signed her divorce papers, carrying only a small bag. A third had been cast out by her family for shaming their name. I looked at each of them, and in every face, I saw some version of my own at different times in my life. Are you sure I can stay here?" one woman asked, her voice trembling. "Here," I said, "no one asks where you came from. We only ask if you want to start again." She broke down crying, soft, sudden tears like the first rain of spring. I didn't try to comfort her with words. I simply touched her shoulder and said, "You'll be okay. I know, because I've been there." It wasn't a promise, it was testimony, spoken by someone who had fallen and risen again. I showed her around the house, the small kitchen with its long wooden table, the reading corner, the bedroom with single beds and windows facing the lake. Everything was simple, but full of light. On the living room wall hung a wooden sign with the willow leaf and golden thread logo. "If anyone asks," I told her, "just say, 'This is home,' nothing more." She nodded, holding her baby closer. By noon, Frank arrived with eggs, milk, and that gentle smile of his. He knocked 3 times before stepping in, his sleeves still smudged with soil. "Enough breakfast for the week," he said. "The hens are busier than I thought." I watched him move among the women, his frame big, rough-edged, but kind. No one was afraid of him, even though he said little. Maybe they sensed what I once had, a man who had been silent and had learned, finally, how to stand on the right side. Frank set the basket on the table and turned to the young mother from earlier. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emma, sir." "Emma," he nodded. "That's a good baby you've got there." She smiled, the first time since she'd walked through the door. Frank looked at me, and the smile in his eyes said everything words couldn't. By evening, the smell of freshly baked bread filled the house. Everyone sat around the table, quiet for a while. Then the silence broke. Soft laughter, low conversations, the clinking of dishes, a baby's giggle, and the sound of wind at the porch. The sounds of a house learning to live again. I looked around and felt something rise inside me. Not pride, not joy, but a deep peace, like standing on the very ground that once buried you and seeing flowers grow from it. Frank sat in the corner, not eating, just watching. The evening light brushed his face, so kind I couldn't look away. "What do you think?" I asked. He smiled. "I think every home deserves to sound like this, at least once in its life." I laughed softly. Outside, the lake had turned silver. The women kept talking, their voices lighter now as they told old stories, and I just sat there, listening to my own heart whisper. I built what I once needed. In the days that followed, Willow House began to fill. No one kept count of how many lived there. We only knew that every night the windows glowed with warm yellow light, like the heartbeat of a small village by the lake. Sylvia had grown taller, her hair now brushing her shoulders. She ran across the yard, laughing, chasing after the new children who'd just arrived. Tiny footsteps danced on the grass, mingling with the whisper of wind through the birch trees. "Mom, I won!" "Did you?" I smiled, setting down my basket of yarn. "Then the winner gets to help me gather some firewood." "Yes, ma'am!" she shouted, her voice bright and clear. That sound carried out across the yard, across the lake. Maybe it was the laughter this house had been missing all those years. By afternoon, Frank arrived with baskets of eggs and fresh milk, like he always did. He had grown older, his step slower, but his eyes still held the same gentle light. Whenever he walked in, the children ran toward him, wrapping themselves around his legs. "Grandpa Frank!" they squealed. He pretended to frown, but his mouth betrayed him with a smile. "You little rascals. You only come for the eggs, don't you?" "No, we come for hugs!" Sylvia shouted. Laughter burst out, echoing through the wooden house. One morning, while I was hanging blankets on the porch, the mailman stopped by. "Morning, Miss Diana," he said in his warm, gravelly voice. I blinked. "What did you just call me?" "Miss Diana, the firekeeper." I laughed, unsure whether to deny it or say thank you. "Who told you that?" "The whole town," he said. "They say you're the one keeping the fire here from ever going out." I looked back at the house. Blue smoke rose from the chimney, curling gently into the sky. The fire wasn't just in the stove anymore. It was in the eyes of every woman who lived here, in the quiet breath of the children sleeping soundly, and in my hands each night as I wove new threads of yarn. That afternoon, sunlight streamed through the window as I sat in the living room. The sounds of wind, leaves, and laughter outside blended into a soft harmony. I picked up my needles and kept knitting the new blanket. Each stitch held a story, another woman who had walked through darkness. The gentle tap of the needles against the wooden frame made a rhythm, steady and warm, like a heartbeat. Frank sat by the door reading the paper. Every time the needles clicked, he'd glance up and smile. "That sound," he said, "it makes me feel at peace." "Me too," I answered. "It's like it's mending all the torn places inside." Outside, Sylvia was still laughing, her hair catching the sunlight. One of the young mothers watered the garden, another guided her baby's first steps. Each small, ordinary moment felt like a miracle. As the sun began to set, I put the needles away and smoothed the unfinished blanket. The golden threads caught the light of dusk, the same warm color I'd seen the day Frank pointed toward the lake and said, "Build your house here." Now that house no longer belonged only to me. It belonged to everyone who had ever needed a roof under which to breathe again. I heard the chickens calling at dusk, the sound of a door opening, then the familiar footsteps. Frank stepped onto the porch, handing me a cup of ginger tea. "Long day, huh?" "Yeah," I smiled, "but a day worth living." We stood side by side, watching the lake fade into a soft shade of violet. Smoke curled up from the kitchen chimney, and the sweet scent of waffles drifted on the wind. "Do you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" "That sound. The sound of life." Frank nodded, saying nothing more. He just gazed out over the fields where the last light of day lay across the rooftops, glowing in that wheat gold hue, the color of rebirth. I wrapped my hands around the warm teacup, feeling its heat seep into my skin. That small flame, it was still burning. In this house, in these hearts, and in the people who once believed their fire had gone out. That autumn, Frank began to walk slower. He still wore the same old wool hat, still brought his basket of eggs every morning, but his steps had grown less steady. On windy days, I'd meet him at the gate with a blanket in my hands. "You don't have to come all this way," I said. "I do," he answered. "If one day I stop showing up, the kids will think the old man skipped Sunday dinner." And he was right. Every Sunday, rain or snow, Frank came. At the long table in Willow House, we always set an extra seat by the window that looked out to the lake. The food was never fancy: pumpkin soup, toasted bread, a bit of ham, but it was the meal everyone waited for. He sat at the head of the table, quiet as always. The children told him stories from school. Sylvia read her first lines from a journal, and the younger women asked him how to grow tomatoes, how to keep a roof steady through winter. Frank would smile, his voice rough but warm. "There's no secret," he'd say. "Just patience, and letting the earth breathe." I'd watch him and forget sometimes that he was 73. Those hands, once trembling as he signed his divorce papers, were now steady as they ladled soup for the children. One Sunday, I teased, "Do you know you're the most expected guest every week?" He took a sip of tea and smiled. "Because I bring eggs, or because I listen?" "Both," I said. After dinner, he often sat on the porch, watching the lake. Sylvia would join him, resting her head on his shoulder. She was 12 now, bright-eyed, with brown hair that caught the sun the same way mine once did. Between them was a quiet bond, trust, passed from one redeemed soul to another. One late October afternoon, birch leaves scattered across the path. Sylvia had just finished clearing the table when she turned to him and asked, "Grandpa, do you ever regret sending them away?" Her words froze the air. Frank's spoon stopped halfway to his lips. The wind outside rose, carrying the smell of dry leaves and firewood. He looked toward the distance, eyes narrowing as if watching an old film play again. Then he smiled, not sadly, just deeply. "Yes," he said. Sylvia was quiet. I opened my mouth to ease the moment, but Frank continued, his voice firm and low. "Yes, because I didn't do it sooner." The room fell still. The clock ticked. The fire cracked softly in the stove. Everything moved in one slow, tender rhythm. I looked at him, the man who had once been afraid, who had once stayed silent and lost everything for it. Now he sat there, shoulders a little bent, but his eyes bright, like a small flame in the fog. "If I'd done it sooner," he said, "maybe I'd have seen my daughter-in-law smile 20 years earlier." He turned to me. His smile carried something like an apology already forgiven. "Maybe," I said quietly, "but if you had, I might not have been strong enough to stand on my own." Frank chuckled softly and nodded. "True. Everything happens when it must. Only, sometimes a man spends half his life learning something that simple." Sylvia sat still for a moment, then reached out and held his hand. "Grandpa," she said, "I think you did the right thing. If you hadn't, there wouldn't be a Willow House." Frank squeezed her small hand, pride glinting in his eyes. "My dear," he said gently, "if one day you have to choose between silence and justice, choose what lets you sleep at night." I watched them, overcome by something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was what you feel when you see two generations speak the truth to each other, without fear. On the wall, Frank's old clock still ticked, its hands moving slower than usual. The late sunlight spilled through the window, falling across the table, illuminating two joined hands, one old, one young. And in that moment, I realized, some things don't need words of forgiveness, because to keep living is sometimes the most beautiful forgiveness of all. That afternoon, the sky burned red, as if the sun wanted to set the whole autumn on fire before leaving. I stood by the window, watching the sunset glide across the lake. Amber light spread through the birch trees, touching everything, the wooden table, the teacup still steaming, and the wheat gold blanket I had just folded. The light made it glow, soft, shimmering, like a flame. I placed my hand on it, feeling the warmth of each thread beneath my skin. Soft, worn, but strong. Every stitch carried a story. The night I ran, the day I came back, the moment I held my child, and the morning Frank first called this place home. Behind me, he sat in his familiar chair, a cup of tea in his hands, eyes following Sylvia as she cleared the table. The wind stirred the curtain, and the last ray of sunlight fell across his shoulder. That golden hue made him seem to fade into the evening, as if he were becoming part of the house he helped rebuild. I turned to him, my voice soft, coming from somewhere deep inside. "You saved us." Frank didn't answer right away. He set his cup down, leaned slightly forward, and looked at me with that calm, steady kindness that was entirely his. "No," he said, "you saved yourself. I only opened the door." His words caught in my throat. For years I'd believed he had pulled me out of the darkness, but now I understood. If I hadn't stepped out of fear on my own, no one could have saved me. He simply did what good people do. He opened a door and waited for someone brave enough to walk through. I sat down across from him, my hands still resting on the blanket. "If you hadn't spoken that day," I said quietly, "I'd probably still be there." "Maybe," he replied, "but have you forgotten? I'd already been silent for too long. I just did what I should have done from the start." Sylvia walked by, setting a bowl on the table, then leaned in and kissed his cheek. I love you, Grandpa Frank. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I love you too, sunshine. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of dry leaves and wood smoke. Crickets sang through the grass, slow, rhythmic. None of us spoke. We simply sat there. 3 generations, in a house where even silence had learned to speak. I looked at Frank. His head had tilted back slightly, eyes half closed, a faint smile still on his lips. The last light of the sunset washed over his face, gentle and golden, like a candle about to fade. I reached for the blanket and drew it over his knees. For warmth, I whispered. He murmured, his voice barely rising above the wind. Time passed quietly. Only the ticking clock filled the room, steady as the heartbeat of the house itself. I glanced at it, the second hand still moving, each tick stretching the moment just a little longer. Frank opened his eyes once more. Diana, he said softly, when I'm gone, don't cry. Just let this place keep living. Teach them how to keep the fire. I promise. He nodded, and a small, complete smile touched his lips, a smile free of weight, free of time. Then the room fell silent again. Sylvia was folding linens. I heard the rustle of fabric, the sigh of wind through the window, and the ticking clock, until it stopped. Just a brief stillness, but long enough to hold a lifetime. I knew. I didn't need to look. I laid my hand on the blanket where the last of the sunlight lingered and whispered, "The door you opened will never close." Outside, the sunset had faded, leaving only a pale shimmer across the lake. Inside the house, the fire was still burning. That morning, the lake was unusually still. The first sunlight spilled across the water, a golden hue like wheat turned to honey, drifting through the window, falling over the room where Frank always had his morning tea. I opened the door. The hinge gave a soft sigh. The faint scent of ginger tea still lingered in the air. He was there, in his chair, head resting back, eyes closed, the cup beside him still warm, still steaming faintly. I knew instantly, from the way the light touched him, gentle and reverent, as if the morning itself had bowed its head in respect. No crying, no sound, only perfect stillness. A sparrow landed on the window ledge, sang a single note and flew away. The wind didn't stir. The clock didn't tick. The world paused, as if granting this quiet exit to a man who had once learned how to stand at the right time. I stepped closer, laid a hand on his shoulder. Still warm, still peaceful. There was no pain in that face, only the calm of someone who had paid every debt life ever asked of him and left everything else to the light. "You're gone, Frank," I whispered, my voice trembling but gentle. The sunlight spread across the bed, washing over the wheat gold blanket he used each night. I smoothed the folds, breathing in deeply. Perhaps he had chosen the perfect way to leave, in his own home, among those he loved, on the most beautiful morning of the season. That afternoon, I found an envelope inside the small wooden drawer beside his chair. The handwriting was neat, firm, slightly slanted to the right. The paper had yellowed. He must have written it long ago, never mentioning it. I unfolded it and read slowly. "I leave the land by the lake to Sylvia Hayes, because she is my second heart. When I'm gone, let this place be where those in need of peace may find it." My hands trembled so badly I had to set the letter down on the table. Sylvia sat beside me, her eyes red and shining. She took my hand and whispered, He's still here, isn't he, Mom? Yes, sweetheart, I said softly, in every breath this house takes. We placed the letter beneath his photograph. Outside, a light wind rose, shaking the birch leaves, as if someone had passed by, reminding us to keep the door open for air and for light. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I sat on the porch, the moonlight silvering the lake. The old blanket rested in my lap. I took up my needle and thread, adding a new patch to a worn corner. Slowly, my hands unsteady but sure. Each time the needle pierced the yarn, I could almost hear his voice beside me. Don't stop. Even one small stitch is still moving forward. I didn't answer with words, only with the rhythm of my heart. Thread after thread, the new golden strands wove into the old, the way lives touch and mend each other quietly, stubbornly, over time. Sylvia wandered out, half asleep, holding the little blanket she'd used as a child. Mom, she murmured, can I help? Of course. She sat beside me, small hands clumsy but careful, guiding the needle through the fabric. And with every stitch she made, I saw it clearly. The flame Frank had left behind, now passing into those tiny hands. I looked at my daughter, a smile coming naturally. You know, Frank left the land to you, I said softly. He called you his second heart. Sylvia looked up, eyes bright as the lake. Then I'll make that heart grow bigger, Mom. I nodded, unable to speak. Night wind drifted through the door, carrying the scent of grass and water. Moonlight shimmered across the golden thread in our hands, gleaming softly, like Frank's eyes watching from somewhere far, yet still near. I added a few more stitches, then paused, looking toward the sky. Nothing lasts forever, but a true heart can live across generations. And I knew Frank's greatest legacy wasn't the land, nor the house, but the faith he left behind. The quiet belief that love, even when late, can still save an entire life. Years passed. The lake stayed still as a giant mirror, reflecting a sky that kept changing with every season. But Willow House was no longer the small cabin it once was. Now it had a library, a garden, even a small legal room where women could learn about custody, property, and the right to stand tall. I looked around. The walls were lined with old photographs. Frank smiling, Sylvia holding her daughter, and me, in my worn sweater, a cup of tea in hand. Beneath each photo written in chalk, everyone who comes here deserves to begin again. In the garden, the scent of lavender mixed with the smell of baking bread. Children ran across the gravel paths, while mothers sat reading under the sunlight, their hair glowing like threads of gold. Amid those sounds, laughter, footsteps, the soft creak of doors, I could hear life itself, gentle but real. I'd stepped down years ago, now just the storyteller. Sylvia had taken over, and she did it better than I ever could. She expanded Willow House, connected it with cities, raised funds, but kept its heart the same. A home not just for shelter, but for healing. I sat in my old wooden chair on the porch. Across my lap lay the wheat gold blanket, faded now but still my treasure. The wind from the lake brushed the loose threads, just like that first morning I held Sylvia after the storm. My granddaughter ran up, cheeks pink, curls bouncing, eyes bright as sunlight. She climbed into my lap, wrapped the blanket around herself, and giggled. Grandma, was Mommy really scared when she was little? I looked at her and nodded gently. Yes, but fear taught your mother how to love. She tilted her head, not quite understanding, but smiled. The same smile Sylvia once had. I smoothed her hair, breathing in the scent of flower and sunlight on her hands, and felt warmth rise in my chest. Far down the path, Sylvia appeared through the garden gate, carrying a basket of dried flowers. When she saw me, she smiled. The smile of someone who'd found peace without having to hide anymore. "Mom," she called. "2 new women came today, one with a baby, one who just left her husband. I'm putting them in the south room." "That's good," I said, slow and certain. "Make sure they join us for dinner. Everyone here should know they're not alone." Sylvia nodded, disappearing inside. I listened to the soft sound of the closing door. Not heavy anymore, just gentle, familiar. The wind picked up, birch leaves whispered. All around me were working hands and bright faces. Women who once trembled, now laughing freely. Willow House was no longer a refuge for the broken. It had become a place where people began again, teaching their children to live kinder than the world once was to them. The late light slanted across the porch, catching on the blanket in my lap, making the golden thread glow once more. I spoke quietly, to Frank, to myself, to everyone who'd ever passed through these walls. We did it. I closed my eyes, breathing in the wind and the faint scent of cinnamon tea. Then, in the voice that had carried me through it all, the voice of a woman who once feared, once fell, and stood again, came the final words. I rebuilt my life from ashes and turned my pain into a home for others. Outside, the wind softened, carrying the scent of willow blossoms into the room. The old clock ticked once and stopped. Not because time had ended, but because it had become whole. And in that stillness, I understood. A life may end, but the light it kindles keeps on shining. And so the clock has stopped. My story, this long journey from the frozen winter of Duluth to the quiet peace of this home, has finally been told in full. Thank you. Thank you for staying, not only to hear the words I've spoken, but to listen to the silence between them. You've walked with me through pain, witnessed the breaking, and helped rebuild everything from ashes. My story may have come to an end, but I believe its echo remains, in me, in you, in every heart that still dares to hope. Was there a moment, a character, or a quiet line that found its way into your heart? Please don't hesitate to share your thoughts below. Each word you share is a thread that connects us, a reminder that none of us ever have to endure alone. This storytelling journey, for me, won't end here. If you too believe in the healing power of stories like this one, if you wish to keep walking beside me through tales of light, loss, and redemption, please consider subscribing. It's a small gesture, but to me, it means this, that somewhere out there, hearts are still open, still listening. Once again, from the very depths of my heart, thank you for listening.